Hi, my name is Shani, and welcome to the Experience Designers podcast, where we explore the human experience, what it is, and how we might create better ones for ourselves and for others. In this episode, Aga Bajer joins me to talk about how we can make work part of the human experience for real. Aga is the founder and CEO of Culture Brained, a virtual community of leaders looking for new ways to cultivate amazing and scalable culture. But she's also a coach, consultant, author, and host of the Culture Lab podcast. We dive into why fun, meaning, and belonging are essential pillars of a good human experience and what it means to make space for our humanity in the workplace. And we discuss what it takes for people and organizations to bridge the gap between their intended culture and the one they actually create. Welcome, Aga. I am so happy that you are joining me to converse and philosophize.
I am super happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to see where this conversation takes us. So looking forward to it.
Great. Yes, me too. It's always a bit of a question mark because it's such a big question that I have. But I still like to just tap into to you or whoever comes here. And one thing that I'm always curious about is what leads people to be where they are and do what they do. And just kind of looking at your history and the things that you are doing and have done, there's this core word around culture. That is a very kind of solid theme. So, what is it about culture?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a very sort of cohesive, short, straightforward story of how I got to where I am today, but it's slightly complicated. But I'll pull a couple of threads for you. So I think the first thing that made me really curious about other cultures was the fact that I was growing up behind the Iron Curtain in the communist Poland. And for the folks who listen to this and are not entirely sure what it entails to be growing up behind the Iron Curtain, it's a very isolated situation. So people couldn't travel. It was a very homogenous society where your neighbors looked like you, spoke like you, did similar things to you. And I really can't explain that. But since I was a little girl, my biggest dream was to travel, which seemed almost impossible at that time, and to explore the world. So we had movies, we had books. So I knew that there is a world out there to discover. And so I'd climb on a tree in my aunt's garden. It was an apple tree. I still remember that. I just still remember the whole feeling. And I would imagine that I was on a ship. I was a pirate girl. And I was traveling across the world with these incredible people. Like there was a native Indian and people from other countries, and they all had different talents, but predominantly they just behaved differently. They were different than me. So I had this, I really can't explain why exactly, probably because we want what we don't have generally. So I just wanted to explore the world and other cultures so much as a kid. And I did. So it was one of those dreams that came true for me, and I feel so incredibly grateful for it. And then, of course, there is this piece around company culture. And I think, one of the main reasons why I got really fascinated by company culture was because a friend of mine and I founded an ice cream factory. It was an ice cream manufacturing company. Really crazy idea. We had no idea about producing ice cream. We just liked ice cream. And so we built that business. And, the funny thing is, we were 20 something years old. The funny thing is, this company still exists. It's one of the biggest ice cream manufacturers in the Central Eastern Europe. And so it's a miracle in itself because we had no idea what we were doing. And even more so, we had no idea how to cultivate a great work environment for the people who worked for us. And this was, I guess, like probably the first time in my life where I understood that there is this huge gap between your intentions and how you think about yourself and your impact. Because even back then, I liked to think of myself as someone who's really interested in people, who really cares about people, who wants the best for people. And yet, I could see that we did not have the desired impact on our employees for a long time until we figured it out. And so I got fascinated by this. Like, how do you become a good leader? How do you create an environment where people can be creative, where they can perform, where they feel like their job has a meaning? And back then, there was really not a lot of stuff that you could have access to learn. And that's when I went down a rabbit hole and I really got totally obsessed and started researching this. I did my master's degree on strategic human resources management. I then pursued a career in human resource consulting, starting with Hay Group, which was one of those iconic boutique human resources consultancies. One of the directors was Daniel Goleman, the founder and the guy who popularized emotional intelligence. So it was one of those places where you could really get some answers to how do we cultivate a great culture, a great company culture. And, the rest is history. But I think these two things in my life, first, growing up in a very homogenous environment and craving diversity and craving different cultures, and then that realization, oh my gosh, you can have good intentions and still not have the impact that you want to have in the workplace. Yeah, they probably brought me to this path that I still walk today.
I love that. Just felt very explorative listening to you. And what really resonates also is this what you talk about, this dissonance between your intention and the impact you want to
Mm,
see, which is an observation I share with you also, is in terms of company culture, that quite often where we kind of fall short is that we're not bridging that gap in an intentional or
mhm.
qualitative way. And so we have a one culture that we talk about and one culture that we're actually living
Yeah.
in, and they're not the same. So that leads me to the bigger question. You've spent then a lot of time in this rabbit hole of exploring how to bridge that gap. What are some of your conclusions around what makes for a good experience for people, or a more human
Mm,
way of doing things?
mm. You know, I will start at a very high level in the sense that I will zoom out of the world of work for a moment to sort of relate to that notion of a human experience and what that even is. Because I think that it's super relevant when we talk about human experience in the workplace. And often we forget that humans are humans are humans. And it's really irrespective of what context they are put into, we still have these elementary human attributes and needs and motivations. And, not to sound too morbid or too philosophical, I think one thing that comes up for me when I think about human experience is our mortality. We know if there is anything that is certain in our lives is that they will come to an ending. And that frames our human experience in a really interesting way because it basically tells us, well, an average human being has 4,000 weeks in their lives. And so, like, what do we do with this time? And if we think about a human experience this way, that we have, one of the most precious resources that we have is our time on this earth, we realize that obviously every single minute, every single hour, every single moment of our lives is precious and important. And bringing it to the workplace, when I think about human experience, I'm thinking every adult spends at least a third of their lives at work. Of that precious time that we have so little we spend at work. And if you look at data, whether it's engagement surveys or other data, we quickly realize that the time that is being spent at work is not a time that people enjoy. Very often it's a time that causes them a lot of suffering, a lot of frustration, a lot of disappointment. And so I think what's truly important when we think about being human is that we think about life at work in the same way as we think about life full stop, that it should be fun, that it should be meaningful, that we should be able to get a sense of belonging at work as well as in our lives, because life is short and we deserve this just as a human being. So this is what emerges for me, and this is what comes up when I think about a human experience. There are many more things that of course come up, but I'm just curious where you want to take this conversation. So I'll take your lead and follow you.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm I'm following your lead. Just what jumped out at me, and I tend to make a little bit of notes just to kind of follow my own thinking, is just that life and life at work are equivalent. They're the same.
Mm-hmm.
And that we are human anywhere that we show up.
Mm-hmm.
We're not more or less human at home or at work. We're
Yeah.
always bringing with us our brains, our bodies, our sentiments, our history, all of that. It all comes into every context. Yeah, I'm just curious maybe to probe a little bit deeper, because I totally see where you're going with this. And I know that three of the words that often come back in your shares and in conversations with your fun, meaning, and belonging. So maybe we can dive a little bit more into what those are and what they
Mm.
mean and why they're important.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's do a little bit of a deep dive into each of these. And, before we start recording, we had this lovely chat about what has been happening in our lives and the experiences that you've had. So I'm going to use this to illustrate. So you've
Yeah.
mentioned that you had this incredible experience of going to a really short morning concert and listening to music at the very beginning of the day. And what a wonderful experience that was. And we kind of tried to unpack it and understand what was so special about it, and how come that the energy of that experience was so powerful and that you wanted to carry it throughout the day. Um, and this is exactly what fun is to me, and also what we have discovered through our research, which is basically the first element of fun, both in life, I think, and in the workplace, is having an opportunity to experience something that allows us to be fully present. Often it's a sense of flow that we experience when we are immersed in an activity that is really absorbing and that energizes us. But it can be engaging in art. It can be just being engaged in a conversation like this one. Um, I think what's interesting about fun is that you can only experience it now. There is no fun in the past that you can experience. There is no fun in the future that you can experience. Well, maybe there's this thing called anticipation. And I think there is an element maybe of fun in a sense of anticipation. But broadly speaking, fun can only be experienced now. And I think what it calls for and what it requires is presence, being really present in the moment. And so, in the workplace, just like in any other situation in life, this is our main challenge. People talk about experiences of fun as these experiences of deep immersion or deep connection. And yet, we live in the times of time confetti. When you look at our calendars, you get these like 30-minute meetings, one after the other. Sometimes they overlap. There is no buffer between the meetings. And so there's really no space for us. And I think fun, innovation, creativity, or even presence, they need some room to breathe. So, one of the challenges, I believe, for humans, and one of the obstacles to have a great human experience, is that we are living this always on, go, go, go kind of lives, where we don't allow ourselves the space to be delighted, to be present, to be connected, to be creative, to really, work on an interesting problem and say, hey, this is, I really couldn't do that. I really couldn't figure it out. Let me just sit for an hour and think about it deeply. Like, when was the last time that you gave yourself permission to say, do you know what? We have this challenge at work and we don't have straightforward answers. When was the last time you sat down for an hour, maybe in front of your window or on a balcony or even in the forest, and just thought about it?
I love that question. And I love this concept also of this depth and presence and connection, not just
Mm,
with somebody else or an idea, but also taking that time to connect into yourself and what
mm,
you're thinking and what you're feeling. I would say, I mean, just to answer your question also, is since having changed track into having my own business, I have been challenging myself to give myself that space more.
nice.
um, I have experienced it to be a challenge within the corporate frameworks. That's not to
Mm,
say it can't exist in there. I'm sure
no.
some people are really good at it. I know I wasn't. Um, but I think for me, just what springs up also listening to how you talk about fun is how we, yeah, I like the word delight as well, is forget we kind of forget the power in that
Mm,
when we're running along,
I
and
think so.
we forget, I think also with needing to be productive
Mhm.
sometimes is a little bit counter this. I like to play with the words productivity versus contribution,
Mm,
because I think a lot of what we bring into any space is not being productive, is being, as you're saying, present, and
yeah.
with our presence contributing with different
Mm,
things, whether it be our energy and our mood, whether it be our thoughts and our ideas, or different things can come into play. So
mhm.
yeah, lots of different
Yeah.
things come up for me, but I love how you're describing this.
And I want to connect the dots between what you have just mentioned. So that differentiation between productivity and contribution and how fun plays into that. Because when I talk about fun, obviously I'm not talking about the shallow fun of, Friday pizza parties or scrolling of our Facebook feed or whatever. I'm talking about that deep fun that comes from a place of presence, from a place where we can be creative, from a place where we truly connect with someone, and so on and so forth. And that is not a place of maximization of productivity. Like, right, when you try to multitask and do so many things at the same time, you usually cannot experience that depth of experience and also that um, impact or contribution that you want to create. And I'm not saying that we should never try to be productive, because there is a time and a place to really tick a lot of these boxes that we need to, or that cross off the items of our to-do list. What I'm saying is we need blocks of time on our calendar to have space for this different quality of engagement in our lives, in our problems, in our relationships. And this is where I put this umbrella of fun, because it really does feel like fun. It's so interesting, when we interview people and when we ask them, okay, so tell me, when was the last time you had fun at work? It's so fascinating to see that people will always talk about similar things, like, was a really interesting challenge. I didn't know the answer. I didn't know if we were able to pull this off. Usually there are other people there, and it's that deep quality of thinking, deep quality of connection, and also playfulness. I haven't used this word yet, but that's actually the third element of fun, apart from flow and connection, also playfulness. So levity, humor, lightness. I think we take ourselves too seriously very often. Life
Yes.
is serious in itself, and sometimes we make it even more serious and grave than we need to. So I find in this research, obviously, that supports that playfulness is so incredibly important if we want to make a positive contribution or if we want to have an impact, or if we want to solve a problem.
Mm.
Yeah. So
I
I love
love
that
that you're
point.
bringing in play. I think we're a bit
Mm,
scared sometimes,
yeah,
especially in the corporate space, to even use that word because
I know.
I don't
I
know what
know.
people associate it with, but I really like that it's
Yeah,
here.
it's funny. There's a lot of pushback when people hear play or even fun. They are like, "Oh, I don't know. A job is a job. Why should, this is not the place to play, or this is not necessarily something that needs to be fun." But the funny thing is, like with many of those things, by the way, that there is enough evidence to fill a whole library that playfulness and joy and fun and presence are what get things done. So if companies care about getting things done, if companies care about creating a great workplace, if companies care about having that powerful competitive advantage, I think they should really get more serious about fun, at work, because fun is serious business, really.
Mm. We were in a previous episode of this podcast. I was talking to Mia and Malin, and they work with self leadership, and we were talking about
Mm.
this concept of bringing your full self to work.
Mm.
And I think it also connects with what you're saying here is if we as companies or whatever context we're building, whether it's a company or anything else, if you want people to come in and be themselves and bring their potential and their abilities to a full extent, then, and I think that's where my big question springs from, like, how do you then actually make it possible to bring that human, to be that human in those
Mm.
contexts?
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I think play is, I listened to an episode of the Huberman Lab podcasts
Mhm.
during last year. It was on play, and it left a huge mark on me. Um, Simply because, and I won't quote it too much because it's very scientific, and I'm surely going to misquote it somehow. But I think the essence of what I took away from it was that we we haven't really redefined play into the adult terms
Mhm.
in a very good way. And
Yeah.
so we're still associating play with being this silly person who like would lie on the floor with kids, which is also a great thing to do, by the way. So
Mhm.
that's not to say, but
Yeah.
as you say, there's a time and a place. And I think what
Mm.
he really did for me was reframe play into being something that just, what is it in your brain
Mhm.
and how can you use it as an adult? And all of a sudden I saw
Mm.
play everywhere.
Yeah.
So beyond the fun is also exactly these things that you're saying, this like
Mm.
creativity, this exploration, the connecting and
Challenging yourself.
challenging yourself
Mm.
and pushing a little bit, and that's also playfulness. So I think for
Yeah.
me, listening to you, there's two things. One is yes, and the other is I think it's also helpful to dare to actually have that discussion as an
Mhm.
adult, is what
Yeah.
is actually play for
Yes.
me now, because
Yeah.
we're not 25
Yeah.
or below, which is kind
Yeah.
of when play plays a certain
Mm.
role in your life,
Mm.
and it can play a very different role. So yeah, I
Mhm.
think it's fascinating that it comes up.
Yeah.
We've touched a little on your other two words, meaning, kind of, I don't know, both meaning and belonging. They all fit together, but yeah,
Mm.
let's just pick each of them apart a little. So what is in meaning for you, and why is that important?
Well, to have meaning, I mean, obviously, there are so many people that have talked about this already. So I'm not going to say anything new or groundbreaking. But we all know that human beings have this inherent need to be a part of something larger than them and feel like they're contributing to something that gives them a sense of meaning. And these might be different things for different people. But unless we have that sense of direction and that sense of contribution, that I know is an important word for you, we will never have a positive human experience to the extent that is possible. I'm not saying that if you don't have sense of meaning, you are not having a good life. I'm saying that if you are missing a sense of meaning in your life could be better. Not that it's not good, but it could definitely be better. And there is still a lot of potential that you can discover. And I think we all crave it. When you talk to people, very quickly, you will realize that everyone is looking for a sense of meaning. Everyone has that question, like, what is my life about, and why am I on this earth, and what are the important things for me? And in the context of work, what that means is really, am I contributing to something that is meaningful to me? And do I see the impact of my work on others? And this is something that is very often underestimated. I think partially this is what we've inherited from the industrial era, where people were working at this production line and basically they were really just a part of the process and saw a tiny fraction of the whole process. There is nothing more dehumanizing than that in the workplace. It's basically treating human beings like robots. But unfortunately, our economy and a lot of businesses were built on that foundation for the sake of efficiency. And so, back to your point, efficiency, contribution over efficiency, or even effectiveness, we have a need. And also, this is what makes us, I think, more powerful than AI, that we can use our judgment and steer towards desired outcomes in creative ways if we get that sense of direction and meaning. So, back to my point, we need to see what is the impact of our work on others. It doesn't necessarily have to be the client or the patient if you are in a pharmaceutical industry, although that would be ideal. But for a lot of people, this is not entirely practical or possible. But also, it's interesting what we've discovered doing our research, working with a lot of companies, usually growth stage companies or scale ups. It was that it was equally powerful for people to have an experience of an impact they had on a colleague. So, not necessarily an end user, but even, how is my work helping a colleague of mine to have an easier life or serve the company's purpose in a better way?
Mm.
So that's definitely important. Clearly, there is a sense of meaning that comes from the accomplishment of our own goals. So for a lot of people, they need to feel like they are progressing, like they are being able to reach whatever they've set as that destination for themselves personally. But I think for everyone, it also has this collective aspect. Am I contributing to something larger than me? Or how can I? And a lot of organizations that I see, they don't provide people with that. And it's very sad because I think first it's not good for business if, again, for those executives who are focused predominantly on how can we grow our business. I have never seen a business that was sustainable that lacked a clear mission and a clear sense of direction and how they are generating value, right?
Mm.
It's all we talk about in business. How is our business generating value? How is our business making this world a better place? And so there is a great opportunity there to be clear about it and to use your purpose as an organization to and connect it to what people are doing so that they have a better visibility into why their work is important, even if it seems like it might not be as important as someone else's job. And that's
Mm.
the case, by the way, very often as well. So, like, you have people who are considered those important contributors, salespeople, whatever, who bring the revenue. And then you have the so called support functions. And even the way we refer to these groups, like support,
Mm.
already indicates that they're not as important, or maybe not, not the main actors in the spectacle of business. And I think it's really important to turn it on its head and make these unsung heroes feel equally important, because they are. Like, obviously, the sales department couldn't function without those support functions. So it's really important to highlight that.
Mm. I love what you're saying around that. And I agree with you that a lot of what comes with the industrial setup is this hierarchy of importance, also in
Mm.
terms of um,
Yes.
who carries the most value,
Yeah.
um, which is hard. And another kind of conflict in this is also when you're talking about value. I was also thinking about one thing that I also see that we struggle with is holding in the same space, talking about creating value beyond monetary value
Mhm.
and being human and like creating value for people in your organization and
Mm.
creating monetary value or
Mhm.
profit or being
Yes.
productive. And it is almost quite often in the discussion like it's a binary thing, it's an
Mm.
option, it's either or.
Mhm.
Yeah, like why do you think it's so hard for us to actually connect those dots and say
Right.
that they're kind of dependent on each, in my world they're dependent on each other?
Of course. And we know that they are dependent on each other, but I think, Shani, you are making such an important point. And for me, this is where I would like the future of work to be, where we will not have to make the case for humanity in the workplace. And where one of the reasons why companies exist is going to be to create a great human experience, not a great employee experience even, but a great human experience. Because back to my initial point, work is part of a life experience. And so if we look at it holistically, work is obviously a really important part of people's lives, and responsible businesses and responsible nations should pay more attention into what experience humans have during those working hours. And so, whilst I understand that today our economy is still set up in a way where we prioritize growth in that is measured by revenue, etc., etc. But I really hope that in the future we're going to see those, not triple but maybe quadruple bottom lines, where human experience is going to be one of the ways we measure business success.
That sounds like a dream.
I know, but actually, when you think about what some of the companies are doing, and I have a front row seat to what some of scale ups are doing right now in this space, because we run a community for culture leaders who are looking for new ways of cultivating thriving cultures. And so they are there, and the conversations that we're having are not really about what is the best practice, but what is the next practice, and like how can we create this workplace that we dream about. And I see a lot of people to really grapple with this idea and how we can bring it into the now rather than just dream of it in the future. Not to say that I could say without any qualms that yes, I have 5 great examples of companies that have already done it 100%, but I'm seeing this movement that is starting of businesses, and not just human capital or human resources people, but people who are CEOs or COOs who really feel that responsibility for the experience that people have at work, not simply because it's good for business, but because it's the responsible thing to do as an
Mm,
organization. So it's encouraging.
it is. I mean, and I share in your observation that there is a lot of movement and a lot of new intentions
Mm,
making themselves visible. There are so many things that you're saying that
mm,
I could pick up on, but just to reflect on one thing that you were saying is this work being part of life. And it's very similar to a lot of the things that we work with, which is actually relating to the work experience as part of the life flow. It's not
mm,
separate.
mm.
We're
Yeah.
so good at compartmentalizing ourselves.
Yeah.
It's
Or we
life and
think we
work
are.
and yeah, or we think we are, and
Yeah.
it's, nature is here and I'm somewhere
Yeah.
else, and rather than seeing this full flow. And then what happens when we, as you say, set out to create something human for the people in the workplace,
Yeah.
and we actually take the lens of their
Right.
life cycle
Mm.
rather than just the 8 to 4 or 9 to 5 or whatever hours it is that people
Yeah.
are working. I think
Yeah.
it opens up so much possibility
Mm.
to take a different lens and
Hmm.
to explore new options.
Hmm.
That said, it's quite
Yeah.
challenging, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's challenging. And it's also quite ironic, right? Because you see so many organizations focusing on social impact and how they can help the society improve, especially in certain areas. And yet they are not thinking about the social impact that they could have just by creating that better experience for their employees. But
Hmm.
of course, we both know that company culture and the experience that people have at work, they jump the fence and they follow people home. And so, if you are having a really bad experience at work, this is going to seep into your personal life.
Of
This is going
course.
to affect those tiny kids that you are bringing up at home, and your spouse, and your friends, and your neighbors. So, really, the ripple effect of that is huge.
Hmm.
And so, my dream is that companies, organizations, businesses, whatever you want to refer to them, that they well, one of their goals is going to have a net positive impact in that sense on the society as well through their
Hmm.
employees.
Hmm.
So it's not just not doing damage, but really improving people's lives because of the work environment that they are creating.
I love what you're saying because it also aligns with an observation that I've been making over the years when you follow all this sustainability work that is being done to
Mm.
take care of our planet and
Mm.
not leave a footprint. And a question that I've had keep coming up over the years is, but how are we thinking sustainably about our workforce and the people that
Yes.
come into our offices? And sometimes the environments that people work in are everything but sustainable,
Mhm.
exactly as you say, because they have negative ripples into
Mm.
their lives rather
Mm.
than positive ripples into their lives, um, which is a huge thing. So
Mm.
it's just including the humans into that agenda, I think, is a massive,
Yeah.
massive piece. I also just want to um, loop back into your third word, which is belonging,
Yeah.
which is a huge one as well. These are
Hmm.
all like big, big
Yeah.
concepts. And what are your thoughts around that?
Well, I'm going to connect it to something that you've mentioned about your previous guest and how she talked about bringing your whole self to work and being able to be authentic, because a part of that, it's one of the elements of belonging, and how we think about belonging, how I think about belonging in life as well. Frankly, generally, not just the work life, but life in general. And, the first thing really that we need to feel like we belong is that sense that we are seen and understood for who we are. Acceptance comes next. But I think the first steps are really I am being seen and I am being accepted. For who I am, and there is no judgment. And that's already a big ask because, as we know, societies and humans are full of biases and judgments. So it's quite a difficult thing to do. But unfortunately, there's no real belonging without that. So for me, when we have all these conversations about DEI and so on and so forth, it's great. But we really need to go back to the foundations and talk about, right, so what is that foundational thing that we need to have in place? Because as Trier Bryant, who's my upcoming guest on the Cultural Lab podcast, said, and I loved it, she said, we talk about DI, diversity and inclusion, it should be IND, because really, if you're middle-aged, white males don't have a great experience in your company, it's not going to be a great place for anyone else either. And so, to paraphrase that and link it back to my point, if the majority of your folks don't feel seen and don't feel accepted for who they are, forget about everything else. You have to fix that piece first. And this can be quite simple and yet quite challenging. Even, and these days it's harder because we are not even in the same space. But I remember from my experience back in the office, we had a boss who would walk into the office with his head looking at the floor and running to his office. And the reason was that he was always late. So he knew that if he raised his gaze and greeted people in the open space, it would take some time. And so he would be even more late for his meetings. And so he would literally never acknowledge anyone from his team in the morning. And, these little things, they do have an impact. And in that team, people didn't feel seen. And it was as simple as that. And
Mm.
so eventually, and I feel comfortable talking about this because he talks about this openly as one of his learnings, how he learned how to be a more inclusive leader. And it really started with super simple things like raise my gaze, look at people, and say good morning.
Mm.
you know? And then, of course, don't judge for how they show up, for how they think, the background they have, etc., etc. But that's an advanced skill. Yeah. So that's like the first thing, the most important thing when it comes to belonging is that I can be myself without
Mm.
fear of being judged or rejected by this group. And then, of course, there is this piece around can I then contribute? Can I contribute to this group in a meaningful way? And are my contributions valued by this group? Because the reality is, this is how we are wired. This is the ancient human wiring. Contribution, back to your point, has been a survival mechanism for us. In those ancient tribes, if someone was not useful to the tribe, they would just kick them out and they would become lunch for a lion. So this is what we need to feel. And often, unfortunately, especially in very bureaucratic or hierarchical organizations, people feel like a cog in a machine that is not really meaningful and important. And it's really hard to contribute in meaningful ways. So it takes away from a sense of belonging. So creating space for people to contribute is super important. And the third level, the most advanced level, I would say, when it comes to belonging, and when you really know that you belong to a group, is where not only you are being seen and accepted, not only you can contribute in meaningful ways, but you can also challenge the status quo.
Mm.
And you can say, the way we're doing this, it's stupid. I have a better idea. Do you want to talk about it? That, of course, requires a huge amount of psychological safety. So there is no belonging for me without psychological safety. And these are the three levels that we talk about when we talk about belonging. Take a family, same thing, really, when you think about a family. I've read somewhere, and I'm sorry that I cannot quote the source because I completely forgot, but it was so shocking and in its truth to me. There was research that you can predict the rate of divorce in couples just by observing how they greet each other when the other person enters the house after they've been away for a few hours. And so there are couples that the person, whatever they're doing, reading a book or cooking a meal, basically greets the other person without raising their gaze, or maybe even doesn't greet them. Someone walks in and you just completely ignore them. Or there are couples or family members that will raise their gaze. There will be a greeting. There will be genuine interest in how are you, and so on and so forth. So you see that in families as well. And again, same human experience at work. If you don't have these three things, you cannot talk about a sense of belonging. And it takes work to, of course, to cultivate that.
Mm. I love what you're saying here around it not being about agreement. So I
Mm-hmm.
think sometimes we attribute belonging to being quite homogenous,
Yeah.
and it isn't. It is about diversity of
Yeah.
ideas and
Yeah.
diversity of personality and
Mm-hmm.
diversity of everything, having space to exist in the same setting and it being okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
then,
thank you,
yeah.
Shani, for underscoring that because I find myself not emphasizing that enough, but it is so incredibly important. I always say, that people often will think that a great team or a great team culture is about harmony. Um, And the reality is that the greatest teams out there have enough psychological safety to have that intellectual friction. And there is actually a lot of intellectual friction and debate, because you have trust and you know that you are not taking an interpersonal risk by speaking truth. And I've been reading ancient Greeks recently, and it was so wonderful because there's a word and it's called parousia. And parousia in ancient Greek, it means basically say it all. And it was particularly used in the context of speaking truth to power, but not only. It's basically like being able to speak your mind. And that's never harmonious, and even in personal lives and in personal situations, if someone asks you, hey, do I look good in this dress or whatever, and you don't think it suits them and you say that, it feels a bit, mm, not the most comfortable thing to do. It's definitely not harmonious, but the intention behind that is what's important. And when people know that the intention is, I have your back and I'm doing this because I want to help you out, then you can say anything. So parousia can exist, but it's not easy to build it, for sure.
No, I think it's definitely a practice, I think. And it's one of the things that we discussed in the previous podcast around self-leadership as well, is as much as it is every interaction is about what you bring and how you take
Mm.
responsibility for that, of course, and how you decide to show up. It's
Yeah.
also how you receive the other.
Mhm.
And so
So
it's
true.
this dual thing, I think, especially when there is that
Mm.
sharing and that potential friction,
Yeah.
which that's the way we advance. So
Yeah.
we need the friction, but
Yeah.
is I think just listening to you, my thought was a lot around it becomes about not not how much friction we have, but how well we deal with the
Yes.
friction and
Yes.
how well we can transmute or transform it
Mhm.
into something that serves us, because
Mhm.
it can create a lot of bad things if we are not um, present
Yeah.
or conscious enough to make
Yeah.
something of it. And it
Yeah.
can also produce really, really fantastic things.
Mhm.
So there's
Mm.
that. And I guess maybe that's where it's also difficult to find the sense of trust because it
Mhm.
is scary.
Yes.
You don't know where
Yeah.
you end up with
It
it.
is scary. And I think you really need a deep sort of relationship and that foundation of trust with people to be able to do that. And I love this point and this thread that you pulled out from our conversation about how you receive it. Because, I think our society generally, it's quite an individualistic one. And very often we put emphasis on courage of the individual to speak up. But I personally, boldness is one of my personal values. And so I've always valued being bold, being truthful. And I also found that there are certain environments or certain people where it's much easier to be truthful, and certain environments when it's completely impossible. And so I think it's, especially if we are talking to an audience of people who are in companies interested in cultivating healthy cultures, it is more of a systemic problem than an individual problem. And we really need to think about how do we create an environment where the truth is welcome and managed, as you say, and digested in a positive way.
Hmm.
So it's not just how we communicate those truths, but it's also how we receive them, as you say, absolutely. And whether we do have a system where we have these listening spaces. This is something that Megan Rates, one of the guests on my show, talks about beautifully. And if you ask an average company, what are your what are your speaking or listening spaces that you create for your employees, they will say, "What? What are listening spaces like?" And I think that's such a valuable practice to really have some sort of a mechanism where there's a context, you know what's expected from you, that this is a place where we come together to talk about difficult topics and to digest them in a way that is going to lead to positive outcomes
Hmm.
and enable us to make positive contributions.
I would love to dive into that a little bit more. You're talking about some quite practical examples,
Mm-hmm.
creating spaces. So,
Mm.
what can it look like? And what does it look like
Yeah.
from the things that you're observing when
Yeah.
companies actually intentionally create the spaces
Mm.
for fun, meaning, and
Mm.
belonging? What
Yeah.
are some of the things that they do?
Yeah, so I can share something that we've seen many companies do because we often support them to do that, and that's around how can our culture help us to bring our vision to life, and how can our culture um, help us execute on our strategy. And this is basically a session where we bring people who talk about what's the vision for the business, talk about strategy, talk about the main business goals. Typically, these are senior leaders, although sometimes we will identify a group that we call a culture squad, but our clients very often use different words for this group of people. And these are basically folks who are really well connected within the organization. So social capital is incredibly important. But what's also incredibly important is how much trust they have with the other team members. So we call them either informal influencers or culture squad members because people trust them, people are well connected to them. And so this group of people sort of presents where we are going, what we're trying to achieve, et cetera, et cetera. And then we engage the whole organization in this incredibly simple yet powerful exercise of what do we need to stop doing in terms of mindsets, assumptions, behaviors, practices, workflows, because it hinders our ability to bring this vision to life, and it hinders our ability to execute on our strategy. This is often done anonymously to create safety, and especially when you don't have a high level of maturity when it comes to psychological safety, it's better to do this anonymously. So we ask this stop question, then we ask the start question. So what do we need to start doing in order to bring our vision to life? Again, when it comes to not only just doing things, but what mindsets, what assumptions, what beliefs, what practices, what workflows, etc., etc. And then finally, what do we need to continue doing? And this is about celebrating what already works well. And after we gather that data from people that is in the context of how can we be a successful organization, we rely on that culture squad to have a series of two-way conversations with people to really get to the root causes of the themes that have been identified. So, you might see that we need to stop shooting ideas down as a thing that needs to stop if we want to be more innovative, because we will need to be more innovative to reach our vision. And yet, whenever someone comes with a new idea, there are 10 people who will immediately shoot it down. So there is a conversation and a listening space organized for the key themes where we try to understand what are the root causes of that. So we try to have a conversation not just about what's happening on the surface, because that's not enough, but what is people's experience and where is this coming from, so that we can address the problem at the root level as well. So this is an example of what companies do. I think that um, given the stage of our evolution, I would say, as businesses, this is a good approach because it's so directly connected to the business outcomes that it kind of makes sense. If you suggest something like that to a CEO, they will say, yeah, okay, I'm willing to invest people's time in this because it sounds like it makes sense. I think one of the unfortunately mistakes that a lot of people do when they try to create these listening spaces is that they start from the ideal, which would be people should care about human experience at work no matter what. And so we have this conversation that is slightly outside of the context of the business. And then you don't get enough support, you don't get enough buy in, and it never happens, basically. So I think going back to the point of how do we create these workplaces that are built on these foundations of fun, meaning, and belonging, one of the things that I've learned is that we need to be pragmatic, and we need to, someone said, that it's incredible what you are able to accomplish if you are willing and open to someone else taking credit, for example.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that what I see happen very often in organizations is that we are way too idealistic. We want to be seen as the change agent, and it really doesn't always work this way. Whereas if we are willing to have someone else drive this and support the creation of that environment for the sake of the business, because that's the main priority for the business, it tends to be easier to drive the change forward. So that's one of my learnings, that whereas we would love to see that world where everyone is committed to creating a great human experience, irrespective of whether it's helping the business or not. Today, the reality is it helps if you can show how it's going to help the business be successful.
Mm. I love these. Just made a note, kind of, because these things are both on a collective and individual level, is listening and asking questions, connecting into the business, making culture part of the business, not a sideline satellite thing that's going on. And I love your point on it. It's the same thing that I have observed for years, is to leave your ego at the door.
Yes,
It's, yeah,
exactly.
I've had this term for years of working of, I call it fall in love with the impact,
Mm-hmm. Yes, I
which
love it.
is, and
I love
I
it.
know I listened to you and you were talking about commitment versus attachment.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that's in the same ballpark of things,
Mm-hmm.
is commit to the impact. Don't attach to the idea or your method or whatever it is that you
Mm-hmm.
came up with.
Yes.
Commit to what it is
Mm-hmm.
that you want to see as a result, and be willing to leave all of the rest and whoever came up with it. And even if it was you, and even when it's hard, and then step
Yeah.
away and take a breath
Yeah.
and throw it out,
Yeah.
which is really hard. Just to
Yeah.
wrap up,
Yeah.
I want to ask you, because here are some concrete things that you said. These are such big questions, and it can feel really daunting to start tackling them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, is there anything else you think? And I want to say, yeah, on an individual or maybe on a team level, something more aside from these
Mm-hmm.
things that we already talked about, that people can do
Mm.
to start kind of getting on this journey
Yeah.
towards including the human.
Yeah. Yeah. What a wonderful question, Shani. Probably, first of all, we've already had a few amazing conversations, and I think um, we really resonate with what each other is saying. So I'm not surprised that you are asking such great questions, and I'm grateful because it kind of helps me reflect on it as well. And as you might know, having listened to a few episodes of my show, I feel like it's incredibly important to give people some actionable insights. And so thanks for this opportunity to speak to that. So really quick, I am a big believer in what French. I'm not a French speaker, but I just love what it sounds like in French. There is this phrase "petit action," and it's basically small actions. It's like these baby steps. And so I am a big fan of creating a great culture and human experience through these small baby steps and baby actions, using the idea of a flywheel. So it's basically, what do I mean by that? If you had a huge turbine, right, and if you wanted to put it in motion, you would push on it and try to put some pressure so that you move it forward. And the first push, the second push, the third push, the fifth push, nothing happens. And then suddenly at the sixth or whatever, it starts moving, and then it gains momentum and it keeps going on its own. And the question that people love to answer is, was it the fifth push or the sixth push or the seventh push that was the most important? And obviously the answer is no, they were all important. And so back to the tiny steps and tiny actions, this flywheel idea is create your flywheel. So define what a good human experience at work looks like in your company. And you have all the right to create your own definition. And frankly, I think that's the only way, because every organization is different, or every human life is different. And we have all the right and all the creativity also necessary to do that. So define what is it that makes a great experience. For me, the pillars that I have found are fun, meaning, and belonging, but they might be something completely different for a specific organization, but define them. And once you have these elements identified, what makes a great experience in your company, in your life, then I would say identify these petits actions, or tiny steps that you can take in order to start that flywheel effect. And you will not see results. And that's where I think the discipline of the practice comes in. You will not see mind blowing results immediately, and that's okay. And that's exactly what the game is all about, because we need to have the courage. And this is where my value, I guess, of being bold comes in, because we really need to have the courage to keep with the practice and making the positive changes without seeing results immediately. So, to your point about impact and contribution, I think by taking an action, you are making a contribution. And you should always be thinking, we are taking the small action, this is our contribution, but don't be impatient to see the impact. It's going to come. And the flywheel effect is going to start as well, but it's not going to happen immediately. So that would be my practical thing. Draw out your flywheel, identify these elements, and then identify collectively, ideally. So I would involve other people if you are a group. What would be those tiny actions that we can take to start the flywheel effect? And see what happens, and experiment with these actions. But don't be too impatient to see results day one. They never do. No one becomes a success overnight. No company creates a thriving culture overnight. It really takes time, and it's okay.
I love that. Think big and act small is, yeah, that's really useful. Petites actions.
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much. We could have
Thank you
gone
for
on
having
easily
me.
for another hour.
Oh, for sure.
But
Sure.
just a huge thank you for
Thank you, Shani.
your generous sharing of your experience, your research, your thoughts. Really, really, truly appreciate it. And I've learned a lot from speaking with you. So thank you
Shani.
so
And I
much.
look forward to our conversations in the future as well, because I enjoy speaking with you so much. And honestly, I didn't know where this conversation would take us. I'm a bit surprised that we landed on these 3 pillars as well, because I was completely open to speak about anything. But you've really helped me to reflect on our work and the way we think about cultivating cultures from a different perspective. So I'm really grateful to you as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to The Experienced Designers. I hope this episode brought you some new insight and hopefully, as it did for me, some new questions to get curious about. A special thank you to Aga for sharing her observations, insight, and concrete tips. And don't forget to click subscribe. And as always, get in touch with any questions or suggestions. That's how better experiences are built.